Thank you, Mark. And as you might have gathered from Mark's introduction, I have a decidedly non-digital presentation going on here. But it seems like that'll be a nice part of the mix here. So what I've brought today is some research, sort of research in progress that I've been doing on and off for the last few years. And I've been drawing letters for about 25 years, and I've been collecting banknotes for actually longer than that. I just realized that recently. And you know, these objects have beautiful lettering on them, and I just like the way that they have these really distinct sort of designs to them and communicate the spirit of the time and the place where they're from. But I realized that they actually do more than that. The lettering on banknotes and other sort of ephemera like that do a very specific and I think very difficult job of pushing back the efforts of forgers. And if you know my type, I like letters that go out and do things instead of just sitting there and looking nice. So I thought this was something that was worth looking into, and I discovered that this story is actually much larger than I thought it was. I originally thought I was just going to write a little blog post about this, and then I found more stuff and more stuff, and before long I had a talk that was about, I don't know, 2 hours long, which I'm not doing here. So I've cut this down to, I think, what is the more sort of complete parts of the story. There are lots of stories, and this, like I said, this is ongoing. So I wanted to start with what I think is probably the most familiar security device. It's actually, it's also one of the oldest, and it's already made of letters, which is our signature. And we've been using this for, I don't know, over 1,000 years and more to prove that we say who we are and mark a document as being authentic. And with signatures, we expect the sort of the weirdness of being human to make something that's mechanically unique, but we also expect it to say something about our personality. It needs to be reflective in that way. And these ideas about what a signature means as far as security and also its sort of emotional quality became a surprisingly public discussion in the United States around January of 2013, when President Obama nominated this fellow to be the new Secretary of the Treasury. I think it's something roughly equivalent to the finance minister. And there were objections to his nomination. There's people wondered if he was qualified for this job, if his ideas were the right ones for being good for the economy. And these are all perfectly good questions and the sorts of things that would come up. And then while a reporter was looking into Jack Lew's record and other positions that he had held, he noticed his signature. And for a short time, whatever questions there were about economic policy or ties to Wall Street or whatever, everyone forgot about all of that. And everyone was talking about the signature and this like ruined spring, and sort of squiggly thing that Lew used to sign documents. And there's no one else in the government has their signature on display the way the Treasury Secretary does, because on American money, every dollar bill will have the signature of the Treasury Secretary right there. So the idea of carrying around this little squiggly thing in your pocket for the next, I don't know how many years, was just, I don't know, that was just too much for some people. And for Lew's opponents, it was all the proof that you need, to see that Lew was just not qualified for this job. He's just so lazy. Look at how he signs his name. Can't even be bothered to do that much work. And this story became so loud and persistent that the president himself actually had to acknowledge this. And in a press conference that month, he said, and this is the President of the United States talking here, "I had never noticed Jack's signature, and when this was highlighted in the press, I considered rescinding my offer to appoint him. Jack assures me that he is going to work to make at least one letter legible in order not to debase our currency should he be confirmed as Secretary of the Treasury." And I should say, I'm not a scholar of presidential history, but I'm pretty sure that the President of the United States has never scolded anyone in public for their handwriting, but he may be the first one, I'm not sure. In the end, Liu was confirmed as Secretary of the Treasury and went off somewhere to practice a more conventional sort of signature. I'm not sure that that says Jack Liu. I think that says something else, but I think we can agree that these are in fact letters and not some sort of, I don't know, whatever the other thing was. But this brings us to where most of, where we're spending a fair part of the research here, which is in the design and the production of banknotes. And the first kind of forgery that I want to talk about is fabrication. There's the creation out of nothing of something that appears to be from some legitimate body, usually an agency of the government. And we'll start with this fellow, Benjamin Franklin. And apart from being a statesman and philosopher and scientist and all these other things, he was also a printer. Began his career as a printer when he was 12, and that was a part of just about everything else he did up until I think 3 weeks before he died. He was always printing something. And from, I believe it was 1734 to 1761, he was the official printer for the state of Pennsylvania. And that meant that it was his job to print up notices of legislative meetings and announcements and so on, but also printing the money. Back in the days of the American colonies, every state looked after their own money. It was a very American way of doing it. Just go off and figure it out yourself and don't bother anybody else. And Franklin brought all of his technical scientific genius to the problem of making Pennsylvania's money the most secure of all of the colonies. And one of his tricks was to work out a process for making printing plates out of leaves and printing them on the backs of the bills. And it took forgers decades to figure out how he had done this. But one of his lesser known security devices was actually in the type itself. And this was, in this bill we see 40 Spanish milled dollars, valued gold, silver, and so on. That is printed in this typeface. And the origin of this typeface has not been pinned down exactly. Stanley Morrison went looking for it and almost found the exact origin of it. It was cut in England somewhere around 1690. And Franklin bought a font of this while he was in London, apprenticing with printers there as a teenager. And I don't know if Franklin was thinking about security when he bought this font, or he just liked the way it looked and wanted to take it home. But he must have realized that no one else on the continent had a font of this, probably. And therefore, he could print things that no one else could reproduce with this typeface. There's a kind of power in having type that no one else had. And so he included this typeface in just about every bill that he printed for Pennsylvania. And also his printers who took, his partners who took over the printing business afterwards. But he wasn't content with just a more or less exclusive typeface. He tried making some of his own. And in this bill from 1771, if you look at the word indented, the type suddenly gets kind of crude right there, but I think it's reasonably clear what someone is trying to do here, is to make this homemade type that is slanted backwards instead of forwards. And just to be sure that you don't miss the fact that it's slanted backwards. It's framed on either side with type, this obscure little script that's sloping the other way. I'm not sure who cut this. I don't know, perhaps Franklin was trying this out himself or described to someone else what he wanted. But the sort of complexity of type on this bill actually gets more, gets sort of deeper than that. If we get a look at all the things that are going on here, there is this back-sloped version of some kind of Caslon thing, this sort of homegrown design, framed by this funny English script that no one's sure where it came from. Also the more conventional kind of Caslon italic and the Caslon Roman, so 4 different things going on here. That actually gets more complicated in the first line because we get this back-sloped version and the upright version mixed in the same word. If we come back and look at this again, this is suddenly way more complicated than it looked at first. And Franklin essentially made a minefield out of the first few lines of this note. It actually just continues with more of the same further down. And just whenever there's a chance to make something that someone else could not reproduce, that he would figure out some way of doing that. And that continued when Franklin was made ambassador to France in 1776. And one of Franklin's responsibilities as ambassador was to print passports for Americans that were passing through. And this was an especially lucrative target for counterfeiters. You could get a lot of money for forging one of these. So Franklin turned to his friend Simon Pierre Fournier, one of the top type founders in France of that day, and commissioned a custom typeface, this script that you see here. Fournier was apparently so pleased with the way this typeface turned out that he called it Le Franklin. And as they agreed, Fournier did not sell this to anyone else. It was just used for the passports. As I was saying before, each state looked after their own money as however they saw fit. Even the denomination, if they felt like issuing dollars or shillings or something else, that was fine. They just worked it out themselves. But none of these other states had the kind of resources that Franklin did. They couldn't go and commission some big name designer to create some custom thing for them. They just had a print shop with some cases of type and some paper, and they had to work out a strategy from that. And one of the most resourceful of these state printers was the Green family from Maryland. And they used a strategy of what's called secret marks. And a secret mark is a deliberate flaw that is built into the design and the typesetting of the bill, so that a counterfeiter will not notice this, inadvertently do things the right way, as it were, which is now the wrong way, and therefore reveal themselves as being not genuine. So this bill from 1770 has, I think, either 11 or 12 different traps laid in the typesetting. I won't go through every last one of these. One of my favorites is right here on the first line, or sorry, the second line, where in this word indented, there's something a bit funny about that second lowercase d, because it's actually not a D. That's actually a P that's been turned around. But if you read through this really quickly, you would miss that. And this technique of inverting letters or flipping things around was one of the Green's favorite devices. So just about any time London is mentioned, the ends are turned upside down. They also like to trim little bits off of letters, just in a very subtle way, so that you wouldn't immediately notice it. So in the word bills on the first line there, the outside serifs at the baseline have been cut off. And you'd see that if you know what you're looking for, but you just roll right over it if you didn't know it was there. And the Greens were quite clever about choosing which letters to use, sort of where in the bill to hide these traps, they'd often use a situation where two letters are near each other so you could make a comparison of what's different and what's the same. So in this bill from 1770, someone's taken a file to one of these G's and cut through it, but there's an unaltered G right above it, so you can see that one of these bowls is closed, the other one is open. And for each one of these examples that I'm showing you, I compared at least 4 different copies of the same note to be sure that what I'm seeing here is not some variation of 18th century printing, and something that is actually there, and someone really did take a file to that piece of type and cut through that. It was very deliberate. This is actually one of my favorites. I'll show you why in a moment. On this $4 note, you see the words of and or and gold, but there's something not quite right about that last one, because that's actually not an O. That's actually an old style 0 that's been dropped in, and it was printed in 1770, so you can look at elsewhere on the bill and see that that really is the same shape. It's not an O. We also see the period dropped off the baseline. They just love doing that. But I was working with a collection, a sort of museum of banknotes and coins in New York, and with one of the curators there, and I pointed out this substitution of the 0 for the O, and he told me that people have been writing about the Green family and these sneaky tricks they've been doing in their banknotes for something like 40 years, 50 years. No one had ever spotted this one. And that just made my entire week. Like, I'd actually contributed something to numismatic history. That's fantastic. I'm just curious, I actually meant to ask before the lights went down, how many people here have done any sort of work in letterpress printing? I think some number of folks? Okay. So you'd appreciate the amount of sort of work that had to happen here to take a lowercase I and its dot, which would normally be aligned like so, and to saw through this piece of lead, it's actually quite small, and shift it over to the right and then secure it on the bed of the press so that it wouldn't move over thousands of impressions. It's actually a pretty serious piece of work to do. But this is another really beautifully subtle trick to sort of trap, delay for someone. I want to sort of back up for a moment for a little bit of type history. The sort of the old style genre of italics started with the form of a lowercase h that you see on the right here. This very elegant form where the arch swings up and around and down and back, and this really beautiful form that can unfortunately be mistaken for a lowercase b if you're not careful. So later designers and punch cutters use the form that you see on the left that takes its cues from the lowercase n to be less ambiguous. So if you hold that thought for a moment. Whoops. And we'll come back to 1774. And on the, went to the 4th line, we see the phrase bills of exchange. But if you come up close to this, we realize that actually does not say exchange. That says something, exchange or something. I don't know how to pronounce that. But the idea here was that if an H is going to be mistaken for a B will be mistaken for an H. So we'll just slip this in and run with it. I actually love that. And that kind of confusion of forms was a technique used by another printer who unfortunately did not sign his work, so I can't, unable to give credit here. But there are a number of tricks being done here with the use of letters. And one very obvious mistake, this is supposed to say bill, and that's really clearly not a B, that's a Q. And I suspect that this was a decoy to let the forger think that they've avoided the trap. They can reproduce this and not get caught. The real trap was actually a few lines below in the word treasury. And the problem is that that does not actually say treasury. You see the word currency elsewhere on the bill, and the E should look like that. That's not an E. If you look at the word Virginia, that's actually a G. So again, this is some other word that I can't pronounce, the trigazzery or something. But I would really like to know how many forgers got tripped up on this bill. It was actually a pretty high denomination, so I imagine a number of people would have tried to make their own. And this is probably, this is from somewhat later, from 1789. This is probably one of the oddest things, sort of oddest pieces of typography to show up on an American banknote. This was printed by Benjamin Franklin Bache, who was Franklin's grandson. He came over to France when Franklin was ambassador and was apprenticed to Francois Ambroise Didot, another great French type founder, to learn the craft of punch cutting. And I'm not entirely certain that Bache cut these bizarre, completely out of its mind letters, but it seems likely. But there was certainly no type available from anywhere that looked anything like this, and it would have been very difficult to reproduce this with anything that would have been available in a normal kind of type shop. I think it's also important to remember that while all of this was going on, there was a war happening. The Americans were fighting the British to kick them out and become their own country. And money was an important part of this conflict. So it was only a few weeks after the war began in earnest that the Continental Congress, was the beginning of the American government, started issuing its own money. There was something called the Continental Dollar. It was meant to be something kind of like the euro, sort of common currency throughout all of these individual states, sort of bind them together as something more durable. And by the end of this year, in 1775, the British had started an organized program to counterfeit this money and flood it all over the colonies and wreck the finances of their opponent. And it was the first use of counterfeiting as a weapon of warfare. And unfortunately for the Americans, the British were really good at it. And in 1778, the Continental Congress had to issue this warning to the public about counterfeit British notes. And this is a bill that was posted in public, and it goes on for a while. I'm not going to read this entire thing, but I have read all of this, and about, I'd say 75% of this warning is about the letter forms. And at the same microscopic scale that we were just looking at, there's a line in here about looking for a lowercase y whose descender is a little bit too long. Or I think there's a lowercase c that's out of vertical alignment, or lowercase vertical stems that are too heavy. And it was, I think it was this really unusual moment where typography and an awareness of letter forms was literally a matter of national security. This was the only way that the Americans would be able to defend their economy, was to be able to suss out these British counterfeits. Unfortunately, they didn't work, and the British succeeded in wrecking the Continental Dollar, and I think it was, some say it was the only part of that conflict that the British actually won. But it was only a short time later that the British had their own problem with forgery, because after a century or so of being at war with any number of people, almost continuously, the Bank of England was pretty much broke. And to fix this problem, they took all of the gold coins out of circulation and replaced them with these paper notes. And they were just the same kind of notes that had been used for really large denominations, so 50 pounds, 100 pounds, and they just issued them in 1 and 5 pound denominations. Not realizing that with that smaller denomination, these bills would now be part of transactions between strangers, which is, I think, a necessary condition for forgery to succeed. And so they didn't make any attempt to make this design harder to duplicate. And people figured out pretty quickly that this was very easy to counterfeit, and lots of people did it. And between, I think, 1795 and 1818, 300 people were executed for forging banknotes, and hundreds more were sent to the other side of the world, to Australia, to be banished, which had some interesting implications for the history of Australia, but I can get to that some other time. So the Bank of England had solved one economic problem, but just replaced it with another and prompted this tragic social problem as well. So into the middle of this steps the Society of Arts, Manufacture, and Commerce, which is this society of people who make things and want to make the world around them a better place. And they gathered ideas and suggestions from 19 different people about how to make England's money more secure. And a lot of the suggestions were simply amounted to, how about you try printing it better? That might help. But there were some more, I think, more intricate, I think, constructive suggestions. The engraver Richard Williamson sent in this suggestion using what was then the new invention of a geometric lathe that cuts these, that engraves these intricate intersecting lines on a metal printing plate, put on this beautiful ornamental lettering, and the idea was simply just to print this on the back of the existing notes and carry on, because no forger would ever be able to keep up with this. And he was probably right, but the Bank of England did not want to put anything on the back of the notes for some reason. But what brings us to this report is this fellow, Thomas Kirsten Hansard, who's the official printer for Parliament. And his idea was to designate the diamond size of type. This is back before we had a numerical measurement system. This would be equivalent to about 4.5 point. His idea was to designate the diamond size of type to be off limits for everyone except the Bank of England. It would essentially be a controlled substance like heroin or something. And then this 4.5 point type would be used to print the notes. He also had some ideas about how this 4.5 point type would be deployed. If any of you think that ASCII art is a modern invention, I can tell you that Hansard was there in 1819. Let's keep that in mind. And this was Hansard's suggestion of what a banknote ought to look like. This is not a design and some bits of commentary underneath. This is the entire banknote. And even now, this looks so alien to our idea of what money ought to look like. We can deal with all kinds of variation and diversity in design, but this somehow just does not look like money. This looks like a page out of a newspaper or something, rather than something you would buy a newspaper with. But for this and just about everything else in that report got ignored by the Bank of England. And apart from some fairly cosmetic adjustments of the size of the denomination down there, the seal of Britannia up in the corner, these notes stayed more or less the same for, I think, about 140 years. And I think they I think really the only measure they took was to print it on a different kind of paper. That was their solution. They didn't want to do anything to the way this thing actually looked. But this idea of very, very small letters actually survives to this day, but in engraving rather than in type. And it's a component of currency design in just about every country now, including in America. If you get up really, really close to a $5 bill, you'll see this. Come to a $10 bill, you'll find this. You also discover that the printing quality in America is actually kind of lousy. And this idea of really, really small engraved type began much earlier in the 19th century when the federal government began to take a more centralized role in printing money. In this bill from 1879, the engraving technology and talent had gotten so good that the engravers could actually make letters so small that they would fit inside other letters. And I just love this example, not only for just the way this looks, but the fact that they used 5 different styles to fill in these letters. There's a sans Roman and a sans italic and a serifed Roman, serifed italic, and a black letter. And I think after a certain point, I think they were just showing off, as well as making this more difficult to reproduce. But what I think is probably the best example of micro lettering comes from this series from 1896, and the collectors and scholars often point to this series as some of the most beautiful money that the United States has ever produced. And I would find it difficult to disagree with that. I mean, still, I find it hard to believe that American money at one point in history used to look like this. But this series of notes had these scenes of allegorical figures doing very noble things. And in this one, we get the embodiment of wisdom, literally taking youth under her arm and imparting some lesson, which includes reading the Constitution of the United States. Got to start with that, I guess. And we get the first, I think it's 134 words of the document. And this is engraved on a plate rather than set in type. But if it were typed, this would be about 2, maybe 2.5 point. And I've seen this bill in person, and it is crystal clear. It is amazing. And it's if you ever wonder, how type can be made legible at a small size, it can absolutely be done. I want to go off on a little bit of a tangent here. This is a $5 note from the same series of 1896, and again, I cannot believe that we once had money that looked like this. But also, I think this is kind of amazing because all this needs is some explosions in the background, big fireballs and things, and a line of names across the bottom. And this is a movie poster. You don't need anything else. And in this one, we get the embodiment of electricity, holding up what I always think is a chicken leg, a drumstick, but that's actually a light bulb, which makes a lot more sense. And she's declaring electricity to be the dominant power throughout the land. It's very full speed ahead progress. She's also partially topless. And there's no especially good reason for that. That's hardly part of the story being told here, but this was someone's idea of how you do neoclassical vignettes like this. And some parts of the American public, particularly the sort of upper classes around New England and around Boston, were absolutely scandalized by this. They thought this was just completely vulgar and just obscene. They could not believe that their own government would produce something like this, and made such a fuss out of this that banks around Boston refused to accept this note for deposits. There's a very explicit legal obligation to do that, but the banks in Boston would not take this. And the Treasury Department started working on what we would now think of as a bug fix to just rearrange the fabric, to solve the problem and then just move on. But the controversy had spiraled out of control by that point, that a revision would not correct this. So the Treasury Department just canceled everything. That $1 note, there was a $2 note, the 5, 10, and 20 were about to get printed, 50 and 100 were getting designed. The entire thing was canceled. Everyone was sent home. And 3 years later, the Treasury Department released the most boring thing they could think of so that no one would ever be offended. Though I should point out that that eagle is completely naked. Just want to point that out. But if you take this design and straighten out the type across the top, and you take one of these vignettes, these portraits, on the bottom and blow that up, put it in the middle, you get this. And then if you take this a step further, take out references to silver, take out the blue, put in green, you have the design that has been embarrassing Americans for something like 90 years. And I had wondered how it was that we got from this beautiful, majestic, inventive design to this piece of crap. It was because of a scandal that happened over 100 years ago. It's still kind of amazing. I could do a talk just about what went on with that bill, but there's at least some satisfaction in knowing how it is that American money sucks so much. So that's the end of my tangent there, my rant. But I can come back to the second kind of forgery I wanted to talk about, which is alteration, or taking something that really was made by some legitimate body and altering its value to make it more valuable. And lottery tickets have always been an especially attractive target here, because the value of this lottery ticket is in that set of numbers. You can if you can alter these numbers, you can turn a losing ticket into a winning ticket and get potentially an enormous pile of money. It just takes one number to separate the winners and losers. And from this series from France in the mid-30s, there's a custom set of numbers that were developed. I haven't found out by who, but there's a strategy of introducing these really big serifs that I think are there for the sole purpose of just getting in the way of any kind of effort to alter this, or turning a 3 into an 8, or a 5 into a 6, or anything like that. I also want to take a moment to acknowledge the fact that they figured out how to put serifs on a figure 8, which I have to admire that. I might have never figured that out. But the French returned to this challenge of numbers on lottery tickets a number of times, and came up with a new series in the mid-60s that they were using for, I think up in somewhere in the 80s, I think. Where we see a style that's obviously very, very different and kind of half sort of half Victorian, half computery, but has a similar kind of pattern of holes and dots that are there just to get in the way and to obstruct any kind of effort to alter these numbers. We also get the first instance of what I like to call the self-verifying numbers that have the name of that digit spelled out either in whole or in part underneath it. We'll see a bit of that in a moment. It was about the same time in America. There was this company called the American Totalizator Company, which I always thought was really mysterious and kind of sinister sounding. I'm not sure what that would do, but American Totalizator made these very elaborate, very large contraptions that would be installed at racetracks, and they would calculate the bets that were being placed on the horses and calculate how much money you would win if you placed the right sort of bet, and print the tickets that you would get. And this was all entirely mechanical. There were no computers behind any of this. And in the mid-50s, they added a new security device to the tickets that would be printed that involved a 5-letter code that was unique to each race. And it was unique not only in the letters chosen, but also the rendition of those letters. So I collected a bunch of these, and I've identified, I think it was 8 different styles that were used in, on these tickets, on these race tickets, and none of which bear any resemblance to anything that any type founder was selling at the time. I can imagine that was one of their criteria. So if you wanted to piece together bits of losing tickets to make a winning ticket, it wouldn't be enough to go find an H or a J or a B or something. You had to go find the right kind of B and the right kind of G and so on. And over on the other side of the Cold War, about the same time, in the Soviet Union, there was a kind of standard format for lottery tickets through each of the republics. And in this ticket from Latvia in 1965, we see the serial number on the bottom there, which at first looks like a kind of standard industrial Victorian embellished in some sort of highlight. But if you come up close, you see that they're actually decorated with little versions of themselves. It's like they're pregnant. It's like you see the 9 is having twins. And it was not far from that we get these lottery tickets from Bulgaria. I put this in here because I just think everything looks cooler in Cyrillic. But it looks, I think, cooler still if the rest of the ticket looks something like this. This is the Bulgarian National Lottery from, I think it was the late 70s to the early 80s. It turned out lottery tickets that looked like this. You know, I'm going off on a little moment of a tangent here, but I just think it's amazing that any kind of government body would turn out something like this. Coming from America, I don't expect the government to produce anything that looks like anything. But to bring us up to the current day, if you ever visit New York, my hometown, every weekday morning you'll find these coffee and donut carts sprinkled throughout Manhattan. I believe they're the only reason that anything happens in New York before noon. And then a short time later, they're replaced by the lunch carts that take their place. And if you ever pass by one of these, get a look at the side of the cart right about there, where you will find the license that's been granted by the health department of the city of New York. And these very odd-looking numbers that don't really resemble anything else certainly anything that I've seen. And I spent a few weeks following these carts around the city and taking pictures of their licenses and getting into arguments with lots of people for doing that. But I was able to assemble a full set of numbers here, and I have way more questions than I do answers about this, starting with the fact that the 0 is not the 0, but the cipher, which is, this is a completely not American way of describing this digit. but also just in the forms themselves, like this bend through the middle of the figure 1, or the notches on the top and bottom of each letter. I have no idea what's going on with this stuff. But this is, and as I said before, this is sort of an ongoing project. And this is sort of where I've come to at this point, hoping to find someone in the city government of New York who can tell me what on earth is going with these numbers. There are many other stories that I found through all this research. Like I said, I could be up here for a lot longer, but I hope I've given you enough examples and sort of anecdotes to give you something to think about. So thank you.